So for those of you who know me, you've probably known I'm known to do PowerPoints, and I don't expect you to follow those PowerPoints. I'm going to use it as a talking guide for me, but more importantly, you get to see pictures of some things, because pictures speak volumes in terms of some of our accomplishments. And so what I'd like to do is just give you an overview of infrastructure from an asset perspective as well as budgets, give you a progress on some of our projects, progress report, and then talk about how we're innovatively delivering state priorities. But if you look at the next slide, it shows you a number of things that just highlight what's outstanding about Louisiana. That we have a multimodal system here in Louisiana, whether it's highways, bridges, waterways, airports, pipeline, or rail. We are about moving things, and transportation is really not about how we do it, it's the fact that we actually move a lot of goods, and so we're excited about that. The next slide you see talks a little bit about some of the freight components of what's happening in Louisiana. Huge economic drivers in terms of what we see, how we operate, and what we do. We're second in natural gas production. We've got an amazing port infrastructure system. We move a lot of goods by trucks, so trucks are a big part of who we are and our economy. And the petrochemical areas along the river region help drive industries all across this world. Putting that in perspective, if you look at this next map, it shows you the freight flows for highway, rail, and waterway in Louisiana, and the thickness is what's significant on this particular map. So if you look at Louisiana, we're pretty much covered by a major system of connectivity. This is just to highlight the challenges that we have in the state of Louisiana, because we've got to continue to maintain our competitive position in terms of what we do. And so the Department of Transportation operates on about a $2 billion budget. Most of that, believe it or not, about half of it is actual federal funds. And that number is somewhat inflated because of the discretionary dollars that we've seen. And typically, every state follows the same approach of matching those federal dollars with state gas tax dollars. Most importantly on this slide, you see the gold slide and the green slide that equates to the vast majority of our funding. Over the half the dollars we receive actually gets spent on projects. About a fourth of what we receive goes to operation and maintenance, which allows us to take care of all of the infrastructure that you see here in the state of Louisiana. And then another fourth of it approximately goes for debt service. And that's a part of what's happened over the last 30 years here in the state of Louisiana, is that we've borrowed from our future. It was a tool. It is a tool that has its proper place, but we have to put it in perspective with what it is we need to deliver. And then the smallest sliver of this says that about 4% of our funding is spent on admin and support services. And that's pretty significant when you have the size budget that we do. I've got 4,200 people, and the vast majority of those folks are actually in direct service today, meaning they're on a roadway, filling a pothole, changing bulb heads and signals, doing guardrail repair, all kinds of things like that that are actual direct service type of work. The next slide talks about the expenditures for this coming up year. You'll see that we are about preservation first. We have to take care of what we've built. If not, we're going to continue to lose our competitive advantage. You will see on this slide about $788 million is going to be spent on preservation. That simply means we're taking care of what we've already built. We have over 1,000 miles of interstate, about 16,000 miles of roads here in the state of Louisiana, and that's pretty significant. We've got a number of states that have smaller capacity to move things, but more roads, and you've got others who have less roads with less capacity. So we have the 10th largest transportation system in the country with 4.5 million people. Think about that. So we're in a very good spot. We're going to spend very little dollars, $0 on new capacity. And people are saying, what's the problem with capacity? Well, capacity is what you see when you have congestion points. Some of what you see on the road is qualified as preservation. If you look at some of the projects I'm going to show you in a little bit, we're adding some lanes, but it's really about replacing the existing lanes that are there. If it's on an interstate, I have to maintain 2 lanes of traffic at all time. If it's the original pavement, like we're doing on I-10, changing it means I close the interstate. That's unacceptable to the federal government, it's unacceptable to me and the citizens of the state. So I have to build 2 lanes to repair the original 2 lanes, and the question is, Do I pull up those 2 lanes and have that sunk cost? And absolutely not. So we're doing it in a much more efficient way. And by the way, it is the way that every state manages preservation and how they build roads on the interstate. What also makes Louisiana unique is I've got 12,000 bridges to take care of in the state of Louisiana. And for my friends in West Baton Rouge, there's only one bridge right now that matters to them. But I've got 12,000 of them to take care of in the state of Louisiana. And this shows you how many of those bridges are load posted. That simply means that they cannot carry the weight that the bridge was originally designed for. Whether it's traffic, whether it's congestion, it's an older bridge. You've heard us talk about the backlog of unmet needs. Of that $14.3 billion of unmet needs, about $9 billion of it has to do with those bridges. We've got the 4th largest bridge deck area in the country here in Louisiana, and that simply means bridges are disproportionately more expensive to maintain than are roads. You can have a great road with a bad bridge, you get absolutely nowhere. So that brings you to the backlog. The backlog, as you can see, from 2017 was $13.1 billion. 2018, it was $13.9 billion. And in 2019, it's at $14.3 billion. What does this tell you? What do the numbers really mean? It means, in spite of spending $1 billion in construction, in spite of what we do, we're not able to keep up with the deterioration of our system because of generations of neglect. We've talked about the gas tax being 30 years old. The reality is there's never going to be perpetual infrastructure. So we're going to have to continue to maintain it at a rate that's going to be consistent with the deterioration. And until we invest a little bit more, we're never going to be able to break even. So that brings me to my next slide to talk about what have we done in spite of those situations. Well, in Louisiana, since 2016, we've received more discretionary funding from the federal government than ever before for the state of Louisiana. I spoke to Lamoga last week and I gave them a short statistic that said if you add up every week I've been secretary and add about $2 million every week, that's what we've received from the U.S. Department of Transportation. That's in part because we're asking for the right things. That's in part because we work with our congressional delegation. That's in part because we're doing what the federal government is asking us to do, is to take care of our systems. We've led over 860 construction projects worth about $1.7 billion in about 3 years, and that equates to about 2,900 miles of impact that we've made. Yet the backlog continues to increase with those staggering numbers. We doubled the Port Priority Program to $40 million. From day one of this administration, we eliminated the diversions before the constitutional amendment had passed. And after the great floods of 2016, I thought it was unthinkable if we continued to spend $8 million on flood control. So we're now spending out of TTF about $20 million in flood control. And those are projects that the locals are going to be implementing and managing for their system. We've also been successful at working to fund decades-old projects like the Comey Diversion Project that got fully funded. And at a time when many folks were saying, let's just walk away and go do it ourselves when we could not afford it, we were able to work with our congressional delegation to make that possible. And with their help, we were able to secure full funding for that project, and we expect to break ground later next month. So you can see we've got a lot to celebrate, but there's still some challenges ahead, and that's always going to be the case. The most exciting thing about what I'm doing in infrastructure is you get to see the work. So the next couple of slides are just highlights of some of the things that we've been actually successful at implementing, whether it was discretionary grant dollars or one-time money that we received. We've put them in good perspective. The first one is I-10, traveling from Lafayette to the Chaffalot Basin. That first segment, and Miles can show you this one and then the next one, those are pavement projects that are replacing the original pavement that Eisenhower built. Because the federal government is making me manage my system with performance standards, I have to report where our poor and very poor conditions are. Our freight corridor is I-10. That corridor had 2% of the interstate rank poor or very poor. After this project is done, we're going to have less than 0.5% that's considered poor or very poor for the entire length of I-10 from state line to state line. The first segment is about 60% complete, and in fact on Saturday we put folks on the new pavement while we go and remove the old existing pavement. So we're making tremendous progress. Even in the Brobridge area, you're going to have some really nice roundabouts once we're done, where we're not just building new roads, but we're improving drainage. We had an area get flooded under there, and before, businesses were flooding. I was able to stand there and say, I'd rather have my road flood than your business flood every day. That's a progress point that I'm very proud of in terms of those roundabouts. And then you come down to Highland the 73. That's the other widening project. It's the fastest design build in the history of Louisiana for transportation. And that simply means that we are working in a much more efficient way. We estimate that we'll finish this project in 2020, and it was a design build worth about $72 million. That's going to save about 15 minutes of commute time going and coming for folks coming into Baton Rouge from Ascension or going south from here. And here's another one I like, the Terrace Washington Street Interchange. If we had not gotten the Fast Lane grant, this wouldn't have happened. We began designing this at risk, which means if I don't have the funds to build it, I have to pay for it out of my existing federal funds. So we designed it at risk, and because of that Fast Lane grant, this project was awarded and it's under construction, and it will be open in July of 2019. Is this the panacea for Baton Rouge? Absolutely not. But what it will do is prevent that 3-lane merge from the 110 going to the Washington Interchange, and it's going to allow folks to not back up traffic as much. So that's a real practical solution, and it was only $8.7 million. For those of you who live in West Baton Rouge, you may have seen a lot of the frustration on LA1. I will tell you, the bridge over the Intercoastal needs to be changed. It should have been changed a while ago. But because of the insecure funding that we have, we've pushed that project back because I'm going to have to spend about $140 million to replace that bridge. That bridge is going to consume more than 100% of what I spend on bridges the entire year across the state of Louisiana. So what are we doing in the interim? We're replacing it and repairing parts of it to add life to that infrastructure. We do that every day as a transportation department. So it's been a frustrating issue for folks on the West Bank, but I'd much rather have a little frustration now than have to close that bridge permanently if it's unsafe. And so we've made modifications to this joint repair project. We're going to change policies in terms of how we use steel plates. Believe it or not, we've used these steel plates on interstates and other bridges. We've never had this type of response. We're going to be responsive, and we're making some changes to how that project is implementing, and we're seeing some success. And then the last thing, in the last 3 minutes of my presentation, before I get to some questions, I'm going to talk about how we're pressing fast forward. And so these next couple of projects are really important because they're Garvey projects. It's a tool that we've had at our disposal for a number of years that we've never used. And you heard me say very early on that we're bonding out our funding. Well, this is a little unique because we are bonding out federal funds that come to us, and instead of doing a 30-year bond issuance, we're looking at a 12-year bond issuance. And we're building projects that are going to last 50+ years once they're built. And we're building projects, if you go to the next slide, that we have talked about in the state of Louisiana for the last 20 years. We're talking about projects like reconstructing a major portion of I-10, building the Barksdale Interchange, building the new interchange for the airport in New Orleans, and building a Belle Bridge and tunnel replacement. All of them have economic development value. All of them have local funds that have been contributed to us because we don't have the match to make those projects a reality. And so let's just talk a little bit about some of the successes of those projects. The first one is Barksdale. You need to know that all of these projects started off in 2018 in the same condition. Not having their environmental clearance, not having their interchange justification or modification report, not having a funding stream, not having a team to design them. In a year and a month, we have taken bids on Barksdale, and we have the first design bill on that project from those Garvey proceeds ready to go, to the point that we're waiting on the state to bond the dollars out. That's amazing that we've done that in that amount of time. That project, by the way, came in $20 million less than what the estimate was because we took advantage of competition and we did it the way the best practices tell us. The second is the Belle Bridge and Tunnel. It's the state's first P3. I've been able to cobble together funds from maintenance as well as another discretionary grant that we got from the federal government for about $45 million. And we're putting tolls on this bridge, but we're doing it a little differently. This is a public-private partnership, the first for the state of Louisiana. Today is the deadline for those bids. It too did not have any of the documents that were necessary, and we're looking for the private sector to contribute about $50 million, and be repaid with tolls. It is the way of the future for transportation projects. The next project is the Loyola Interchange. The interim traffic solution will be ready on May 15th when the airport opens. It's a major intersection. It's a failing interchange today. That project also did not have any of those elements. We're receiving bids for that in April or May. I need to double check my numbers, but I think it's in April. And we're going to build a new interchange. It's going to be a gateway for the largest airport in the Southeast. It needs to be a signature project for us. What's going to happen, though, is there's going to be a short period of about 3 or 4 years that we're going to have to live through that connection. We're building the interim position right now. You see that fire station is torn down and the concrete is being poured. We did an interview yesterday or last week, as a matter of fact, and that project is well on its way. And then you have, the next slide is the Calcasieu Bridge and the new bridge in Baton Rouge. I will just tell you on both of those, they need to be a public-private partnership. We're going to need a portion of the funds to help deliver that. Had the gas tax passed in 2017, these projects would be funded with tolls. So without new revenue, it just puts more responsibility on the toll side. So we are not walking away from the toll environment of public-private partnerships. We are simply saying, let's move these projects in a way that's going to get us the best possible proposals from the private sector. So we welcome tolls on those. I will tell you that those bridges need to be built sooner than later, but in the interim, we're having to maintain what we have. The one thing I will tell you, I left a slide out on the bridge here in Baton Rouge, the bridge to the split, and very simply, once the $360, now $380 million gets spent on that, we have a couple of segments. The first piece ideally might be the Acadian underpass, where we're going to elevate the dip and raise the tracks. The second piece ideally will be the flyover from I-10 West all the way to College, and then we will continue to move on the widening from the bridge to the lakes, and then the lakes, and then from the end of the lakes all the way to the 10-12 split. That project is well on its way. We're going to spend that first $300 to $400 million on it. And then by the time we're ready to start building those next legs, we'll be in a position to reissue Garvey and or have additional revenue to complete the project. So when folks say you're starting it and not finishing it, I will guarantee you, as long as I'm secretary, you have the ability to finish that project once you start. We did that on I-49 North, where we started, and 14 years later, we started with just a clearing and grubbing project, and then we had lots of funds come to us, but we had to work at the end, but we got it done. That's how you build big, gargantuan, successful infrastructure. And with that, I think I just went like a minute over, and we'll be happy to entertain some questions at this point. Yes, ma'am?
The intercoastal, I think the timeline originally was June or July of this year.
Correct.
Do you have a new timeline for that yet?
I have a modified timeline, and so when you build joint repairs, or you do joint repairs, recognize you're taking a complete joint out with concrete, pouring more concrete under traffic. We actually were finishing that project in May. We had made enough efficiencies, and that's normally how they work, when we changed the model of what we're doing. So when we added the ramps, reduced the size of the steel plates, gave the contractor the opportunity to work on all day Saturday as you saw, all day Sunday, I'm sorry, as you saw this weekend. We're changing that process, and so once we see what this new implementation looks like, we can then give you a modified schedule. We also required the contractor to stay north, as opposed to working on the south side of the canal and then going to the north side of the canal. And we're saving money in that process in terms of the contract. So we'll give you an updated date probably in about a week or so after we see how this new implementation goes.
The people are worried about when the ramps move to the south span, it's going to cause a backup on the bridge. Have you guys figured something out for that yet?
We have. We've not finalized the decision, but we've got 2 to 3 weeks before they do that. And we are very concerned about what happens on the interstate, which is why we have given the contractor enough time to work in one lane from 7 o'clock Saturday night until 4 o'clock the next morning. That way we can get things done more efficiently. And so we've looked at some other traffic control measures on LA1, as well as some plunging of signals, things of that nature to move traffic. But we're very concerned at what happens on I-10, as well as we are with congestion on LA1. It's nothing we're not interested or concerned about.
Okay, we have there's been talk about the 5 parishes and a little coalition to perhaps push for a tax to build a new Mississippi River Bridge. Should that tax fail, and there's already a lot of skepticism about its passage, are there any other options on the table if this would fail?
So what we tell you is all options ought to be on the table. I do not believe that a local tax alone can fund the entire project, but we can move elements that are necessary to get to the next step. So when you look at how do you fund a bridge, it's going to require federal funds, it's going to require tolls, it's going to require some local contributions like you saw on Garvey. But we also have tools at our disposal in terms of TIFIA loans and other mechanisms to make happen. The reality is it takes a number of streams to deliver a major project like that. And so we welcome whatever support the locals will contribute to it. We know there's some tough decisions that have to be made in terms of placement of the bridge, and then there are issues with utilities and right-of-way. These projects just don't happen. It takes a lot of work and effort and a lot of research to do it. Folks have often criticized the state for a number of studies that were done. All of those studies weren't necessarily our studies, but all of those studies compound and provide information that's going to be helpful as we go forward. So if you look at the Loop study, if you look at what we've done in Baton Rouge, if you look at what we've done at the department, all of that gets melded together so that we can have a better product in the end with where we place this bridge, how we build this bridge, and more importantly, how do we pay for this bridge. So there's always room for support. Any new dollar in infrastructure is a dollar well spent as far as I'm concerned.
Where are we on the pre-construction research for a new bridge? Have we done an alignment study? What's next?
So we're in that process now. And so we've got 5 potential crossings for the bridge that we know are going to be eligible to the Coast Guard. And folks tend to say, when you build a bridge, just go out there and do it. Well, it's great to say that, but that's not how it really happens. You're going to have to get permits, and we know that there are only 5 locations that you're going to cross the bridge. Our concern is not just where you cross the bridge, but where do you go to when you get on the other side of that bridge. We know you need to get to I-10. We know it would be a disaster if we required folks just to come down LA1 to get to that bridge. So all of those are factors that we're looking at, and the most important thing is to decide where that crossing is going to be. So then we can talk about how do you get back to I-10, and how do you get to I-10 on the East Bank, and or how do you get to I-12. Yes, ma'am.
The environmental assessment for the I-10 widening through Baton Rouge that was supposed to release in December, what is the status of that?
So when you go through these processes for environmental, recognizing that no project is ever going to have universal support from everyone in the community, and there are things that we are obligated to do to give a better result to the citizens as well as to the project itself. And so there are a couple of historic issues that we're looking at, modifying, making adjustments based on what feedback we've heard from that environmental process, and you actually go in and make changes to the overall layout. I will tell you, we expect to have our final meeting later this summer. I don't remember the exact date, but it's based on the information that we've received and the homework that we do with that information. And so if you have, for example, 2 new historic areas that are in process, I'm obligated to understand what those impacts are and how do we mitigate that. If you're looking at other traffic alternatives that were suggested to us that were within the scope, we need to do our due diligence to make sure that we could do those things and make some of those changes. So that's the delay. People assume that we just sit back after that meeting and not do anything, but we actually do work and go back and do our due diligence, because if I come back to you and say this is what I'm able to do, I want to make sure that I'm able to do that and not give you something that has a fatal flaw that we should have found had we done our homework.
Shawn, do you expect the gas tax debate in the Senate?
Repeat that question, Will? And I didn't repeat any of the questions. I'm sorry about that.
Do you expect any kind of a gas tax debate?
I'm aware of the industry supporting a particular initiative, and the question of whether or not that bill will be filed and what that debate looks like is going to be something that we will wait and see. I tell you that we do have some reality checks that I believe are essential, and that is the fact that this is an election year. I think the idea that the concepts that might be proposed have to fit a good sustainable policy, and the fact that we've got other states who've done this very recently, but they're in a different position than we are. I think 2017 was a golden opportunity that was missed. I think the other areas, specifically Alabama and Arkansas, are taking advantage of new leadership in place and doing it at the beginning of an administration as opposed to the end of an administration, because you get to a whole array of obligations and commitments that will occur. So I think there's always going to be discussion on transportation, but they have to be meaningful, they have to be sustainable, and I think citizens are saying to us, whether it's LA1, whether it's New Orleans or Shreveport or Lafayette, Lake Charles, all of them have issues that are important to them. And at some point we're going to have to answer those folks and say, here's how we're going to deliver something. And I think in 2017 we had that proposal.
You said Terrace Avenue will be finished in July?
Yes, sir. It'll be finished in July.
What is on your legislative wish list coming up for the session?
So when I look at our legislative wish list, we've got a couple of things happening. We've learned a lot on P3s that we want to do some cleanup language, not relevant to this first one, but because we know on the horizon are two major bridges, we need to make sure that we do that proper. And so we're going to make some modifications to the P3 language. We're going to have some language that deal with how do you introduce other modes of transportation, i.e. scooters, wanting to make sure that we have a balanced playing field for that. And then I think we have some other transfers. We don't have a great deal. To be quite frank with you, my priorities for the remaining portion of this term is to deliver the big projects that we've started and not lose focus of our responsibility to maintain the system with what we have. And I think that's kind of what I've seen in government. When you get to the end of an administration, it would be unfortunate for us to lose focus of some of those things that we've done so well at getting to this point with. Yes, sir, in the back.
You mentioned that you were building projects in the last 45 years and you were spending money or bonding for, say, 15. How much is the total system on the state worth today, and how much is our bonding indebtedness that's left?
So, that's a good question. I've asked a lot of folks to tell me what is the value of our infrastructure system. All they can tell me is in the billions, because when you do it right, you want to depreciate, recognize its current value. I can tell you we have about 14.3 billion in unmet needs. I've got about 15 billion in projects I know I have to build, and I've got a much bigger system that's already in place that's constantly evolving. So I don't have the exact number of what it's worth, but it's a lot of money. I will tell you in terms of what our bonding capacity is, these Garvey bonds aren't a part of the state's bonding capacity because this is unique. We've never bonded this out. Louisiana is in a good position because the law limits what I can bond out to 10% of my federal obligation, which is about $67 million. And in those 12 years, that's what we're going to bond out, a maximum of $67 million. How does that comport with the rest of the state? I think you have to consider the source of those revenues. If you look at the $300 million they do a year on capital outlay, this is a whole separate ballgame. So I don't have an exact answer for that, other than we've never used Garvey bonds. 26 other states have, and we're going to do it very responsibly and not have 30 projects get funded that are going to need additional dollars. The magic around these Garvey projects are that we're building interstate interchanges with interstate dollars, and they're going to be paid much earlier than, paid off much earlier than we're going to need to do repairs to those projects, which will allow us to recycle those dollars. Yes, ma'am.
The I-10 expansion in the lakes area that you briefly mentioned, have you guys acquired all the properties that you need? I think under the overpass there was some issues.
What's
there.
the question?
Good question. What's the question? The question was, have we acquired property? I'm supposed to say that before each question. I apologize. Have we acquired any property in that footprint? So typically what the federal government requires is amicable acquisitions in terms of the early acquisitions, and there are folks who are coming to us say we want to purchase the property. There's a risk with that because if I purchase property that I don't need, the federal government may not participate. So there's a little gray area that I have to be really careful and really clear of what we need to purchase. Most importantly for this I-10 project, we own 95% of the right-of-way today that we need to maximize. And so there's only a small part of what we have. I don't believe we've acquired anything under Perkins specifically. I don't believe that we've acquired anything in terms of the bridge, but we have met with residents and property owners, some who are supportive of selling their properties and others who are just learning the process so that they can understand what their opportunities and possibilities are.
But that is something you'll need to do to move forward with the project. Correct?
Absolutely. So once we get environmental clearance and we are comfortable with where we're going, that will be a part of the process. And I do not have to purchase all of the property at one time. I can actually work with the footprint within where I have it. Typically, right-of-way takes about a year to acquire because of the way the laws are written. And so there's some things that we're going to start doing. And typically on these projects, when you think about CMAR, I have to start designing. So I won't get out there and start building on day one. There's a lead time when you do design build or CMAR to actually design what you have. You can do multiple services like right-of-way, like utilities, while you're doing those designs. And that's why this environmental process is so important. That's why we go out and look at projects and understand some of those questions along the way. Yes, sir, and then yes, sir.
In a little bit slower language, would you explain the timeline for the new bridge to the split?
So, a couple of things. Can I explain the timeline for the new bridge to the split was the question. The new bridge is separate from the I-10 project. So when we talk about the I-10 widening, you're looking at from 10-110 all the way to 10-12 split. That's separate and apart from the new bridge. Those are two separate projects, but go in tandem. And so the timeline for that bridge to the split component is we expect to begin design, build, procurement, ideally on the college flyover, as well as work with the railroad on Acadian later this year. Once we do those as standalone projects, we're in the process now of procuring a CMAR engineering firm, and that simply means one engineering firm is going to be responsible for designing the entire corridor. It gives you consistency, it gives you some institutional knowledge that adds value back to the project. It's the way you do big corridor projects. And then we're going to construct chunks of that based on the ability to plan that out and identify it. So for me, the most important thing I think that we can do is those two first projects, and then start at the 110 area and begin widening to the bridge, to the lakes. Then your next stretch is going to be over the lakes, and then your next stretch is going to be over Perkins. That will take you to 10-12 where you get to college. There are a number of elements that have to be done in terms of surface streets, as well as how do you maintain traffic. Folks have to realize you've got 100,000 cars a day that we have to build, and if you may remember, I have to keep 2 lanes open. So this isn't something that we want to rush through and create real havoc for folks. We want to do it right. We're passing through neighborhoods, so there's certain restrictions in terms of when we can construct. There are issues of sound walls. So what's going to happen is the engineers are going to work with us in CMAR and work with the contractors who are potentially going to be bidding on this project to find the most efficient and effective way to build a project. So do I have a specific timeline for the whole quarter? It's far too soon for that right now. But I can tell you we're in the process of being ready to start acquiring property, start design build on college flyover and or I-10 to college, and then the Acadian footprint as well, which will include a new pump capacity or additional pump capacity there. All of those are essential for the overall project, so I don't want you to assume that that's not included. Everything I've just mentioned is a part of the original environmental document, but that's how you break up the project in small, meaningful segments that have utility.
But is the timeline closer to 5 years or 10 years?
Is the timeline closer to 5 years to 10 years? I would say the timeline is between that 5 and 10 years. Simply because it depends on, there's still some elements that we want to make sure we get right in terms of the aesthetics, for example, in terms of the construction sequence for sound walls versus another piece. What you don't want to do is spend all of your time engineering and never get anything done. So we're going to start building pieces of it sooner than later where we already have all that we have. And so I will tell people, you're not going to build something like this very quickly. It's kind of like changing a tire while you're still driving. It's very, very difficult. And so for us to say you're going to get through this whole project in 5 to 7 years, I think is unrealistic because we want to do it right. But I know if you start to see utility and you start to relieve or some of the congestion in that corridor, folks will be satisfied with that and see a horizon on the other end so that there's additional value placed in this community with the project.
How do you spell CMAR? How do you spell
CMAR, C-M-A-R, a construction manager at risk is how you spell CMAR. It's a new model. It's a little different than design build, where the designer works for the department. We have a contract with the contractor, and we work together, all three of them, to deliver the most efficient project, as opposed to an engineer working for a contractor or having a very linear process that we do it piece by piece by piece. So it is a new modern way of doing construction, particularly complex issues in urban corridors. You may think of the Big Dig, that was some pieces of it. You may think of some other urban development that you've seen in Houston or Dallas. CMAR is a very popular tool. The airport, for example, is being built with a CMAR joint venture where they give you a guaranteed maximum price for the value of which you create.
So
Yes, sir.
You said the state is doing its first infrastructure public-private partnership now, and you expect to do the same on 2 other big projects. Can you talk a little bit more about how much the taxpayers are saving through public-private partnerships in terms of like the proportion of the...
Sure. The question is, can I talk about how much the public saves in a P3? I can give you the one I know of now. So the Belle Chase Bridge and Tunnel is estimated to be about $125 million. That's to build a new 4-lane structure, remove the existing 2-lane bridge, and to decommission the 2-lane tunnel. We've secured about $83 million. The P3 developer is actually going to bring the balance of the funds to build that project. That developer will be incentivized to reduce the impact, reduce the cost, and as such, he's going to get reimbursed with tolls. It's no different than if you go to a bank to borrow money for your home, there's going to be a premium that you're going to pay for them putting their money up. And so until you see their final proposal, it's hard to say what they're going to be saving. In this case, I don't know that the citizens understand the value of a P3 because we've not done one, but more importantly, it closes the gap that the state does not necessarily have the resources to close. And so if we don't use a P3, I cannot keep the $45 million we received, and I cannot deliver a bridge, and suddenly we're stuck with the tunnel that's a car wash in many people's minds, and a bridge that opens 10 times a day. And it stops traffic, and it stops commerce. When you look at all of the work that's happening south of Plaquemine, I don't think that's an acceptable solution for the state of Louisiana. So this is giving me a tool to provide something I cannot ordinarily provide. I also want to caution the public to say a P3 may not always be cheaper, and it gives you more value in this process. And in this country, there have been about 28 to 30 P3s, so it's not as though I can do P3s everywhere. There's a handful of projects. If I had my druthers, the projects on P3 would be the bridge in Baton Rouge, the bridge in Lake Charles, potentially the Jimmy Davis Bridge in Shreveport, the 415 connector, and then 3241 is another project that we're looking for P3 to deliver something when I don't have enough resources to make it happen. And that's a project that citizens have paid for the last 30 years that we've not been able to move because of the bonding mechanism that has bonded those dollars out until 2045. And so we can work within what tools we have to deliver it. So it may not always be the most affordable way, but it's a way to deliver infrastructure because the cost of not delivering it, I think, is far greater.
What does a P3 stand for?
Very good question. What does the P3 stand for? Public-private partnership. P3 is just the name that folks in the industry use. And it's called P3, not P-free. So it's not public-private builds it for free. Public-private, they want a return on their investment with that partnership. So it's public-private partnership.
Last 2 questions.
Last 2 questions. Let me get this guy because he hadn't come, and then you. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to go back to Perkins and the blinding. I was trying to take some notes because my constituents are always asking me about it. First thing is the flyover.
So,
Like in pieces. First
the question is, what's the sequencing that we've talked about thus far? So I can tell you there's some low-hanging fruit in terms of Acadian, because on railroads, they have to do that work. The next piece is, what can I do that will provide some immediate benefit to citizens and get going? And that flyover from I-10 West to College offers tremendous value early on because of the separation of traffic from the main line to that exit, and because of the traffic coming from I-12 that's going to get off on College. So it basically gives you a very long exit ramp for folks coming from I-10, and it allows more throughput to happen more safely on the main line. That part can be pulled out because it's a segment of independent utility that the design elements of what I'm going to do from the bridge all the way to 10-12 split are a little different. And that's why we've identified that. And so we've not gone further than that because we want to get our CMAR engineering company on board to help us design this thing and move in the best sequence to provide utility to citizens. So that's...
Your thinking would be that after you did those two things, the chunks would be from the bridge across City Park, then the next chunk maybe to College? Is that the sequence?
So I would tell you, after what we've talked about, the sequencing that I envision would be going from the bridge to the lakes, across the lakes, and then that stretch from the lakes to College all the way to the 10-12 split, and that will encompass the Acadian. I think it's also important to recognize that that might be the more complex piece simply because of what happens under Acadian. It also offers us some benefits in terms of moving traffic in the interim. If you can think about crossing the bridge now, you only have 3 lanes by the time you get past the Washington on-ramp. So you have a major bottleneck that occurs and impacts everything west of there. Then you get to the lakes. You have a major bottleneck over the lakes because you only have 3 lanes. So those are the most important, I think, to at least add additional capacity, because when you get to this side of the lakes, or the east side of the lakes, you have shoulders and you have a larger footprint that could offer you some benefits to get throughput while you build the rest of the project. Yes, sir.
You mentioned $50 million input from the private sector. You also mentioned they want a rate of return, so obviously it's not a donation. Doesn't the government borrow at a lower rate than private industry? And haven't we seen around the nation where a short-term administration has sold out public projects like parking meters and citizenry fine? They're gone, and they owe now outrageous rates for the child that hadn't been born until after they get out of college. Isn't that a potential in this particular case to do that?
The question was, is there a potential to, I guess, privatize too much, and what that impact is, and how does it affect borrowing? The answer is there's always that potential on every project. I will tell you the government can borrow money at a cheaper rate, but if I don't have the money to pay the government back, I'll never get that money. And so this is an opportunity to front cash from the private sector with the caveats and the protections that they take on some of the risk associated with those tolls. And for our P3, our caveat has been, we want the lowest possible toll for the shortest amount of time. I want to be able to buy out of that arrangement should we run into extra money at some point. I need to give that private developer a return on his investment. There's a cost associated with that. If I went to my mortgage holder and say I want to get out of this and pay it now, they were expecting 20 years of payment. And with that was built-in profit over those 20 years. So they're going to charge me something on the front end. I need to know what that is on the front end. And so I'm in a position as secretary to look at this and say, if it's a good deal for the state, we'll accept it. If it's a bad deal, we simply walk away from it. Again, the issue is our inability to front those cash dollars, our inability to guarantee certain things. The contract that's going to govern the P3 relationship is going to be a little different than what you would see for parking meters or what you've seen in other footprints, because this is a best practice that's worked in Dallas, it's worked in Houston, it's worked in Florida. P3s on roads are a lot different than outsourcing a utility or some other service, because you have traffic, you have risk share, you have all kinds of factors that you can build in. So we think we're in a much better position to manage those risks on the front end. And if it's not a good deal for the state, we say thank you, but no thank you.
Does the design bill have the same people looking for those risks so they can cut their costs and build it for you?
The question is in design bill, do you have similar efficiencies and risk allocation? The answer is somewhat yes, but in design build, I have all the money up front and they walk away from it. In a P3, I don't have all the money up front. I'm borrowing from the private developer and I'm guaranteeing some kind of return or opportunity to earn that return that they will accept. And in return, they will maintain it. And so it's totally different than design build. But as in P3 and design build, you expect efficiencies, you expect innovation, and you expect the private sector to do things that we did not necessarily environmentally clear, mitigating footprint, reducing costs, finding those efficiencies. I think in the P3 environment, it's a greater opportunity because that's less money they have to spend and still earn a return on their investment. And so for the state of Louisiana, we're going to move forward, as long as I'm secretary, in getting the best policy decision that's best practice, using P3s if it's the right model. If it's not the right model, we're back to design build, or design bid build, or design it and not build it, or don't even design it if we can't afford it. And so we're excited about that, and because this guy's in charge, he says that was the last question. And so I appreciate you all listening, and thank you for being a part of this conversation today.